When I first saw it, I didn't think much of it, just another piece of forgotten stone buried in the overgrown grass behind the old boarding house I had moved into for work. The building was ancient, the kind of place where the walls had seen too much and the floors creaked, even when no one walked on them. The owner told me the back garden hadn't been tended in years, said I was free to use it if I wanted to clear it up. The statue stood near the far wall, almost hidden behind a curtain of ivy. It was roughly human in shape, though the features had been softened by weather and time. A single hand stretched outward, index finger extended, as if pointing at something unseen. It should have been harmless, maybe even decorative, but there was something about the way it faced that unsettled me. It was pointing directly at the door to my room. At first, I thought it was coincidence. The garden was small, and my room overlooked it through a single narrow window. But the longer I looked, the more deliberate it felt. The finger wasn't just angled generally toward the house. It aligned perfectly with the edge of my window, the way a compass needle finds north. That night, the air felt heavier than usual. The pipes in the walls made strange hollow groans, as if the house itself was breathing. I try not to think about the statue, but my eyes kept drifting to the glass. The garden was barely visible in the dark, but the moonlight caught the faint outline of that stone arm, and the finger extended toward me. I told myself I'd move in the morning, but when I stepped outside early the next day, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The statue wasn't facing the same way anymore. The base had clearly shifted. The moss and dirt beneath it disturbed. It now pointed slightly higher toward the second floor of the house, though there was nothing there, just an empty window from one of the unused rooms above mine. I went back inside to check the upstairs hall. It smelled of rot and old paper, dust collecting thick on the wallpaper. The door to the room the statue now pointed, it was unlocked, but stiff. It opened with a reluctant groan. The air inside was colder than the rest of the house. The curtains were drawn, but the fabric moved faintly as if stirred by a breeze that wasn't there. The room was empty, except for a single chair placed in the center facing the window. I stood there for a while, feeling something wrong in the silence, a pressure that made my chest ache. And before I left, I noticed something else, small but impossible to ignore, a faint groove on the wooden floorboards running in a semicircle around where the chair stood, as though the chair had been dragged over and over in the same motion. That night the pipes were louder, the creaking sharper. I couldn't sleep. I got up for water and glanced through the window again. The statue stood exactly as it had earlier, finger aimed at the upper window of the empty room. But as I watched, something subtle shifted in its shadow, the faintest tilt of the head, like a bow, so small I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. I went outside the next morning, determined to push the thing over, but when I reached the garden, the statue was gone. The patch of earth where it had stood was untouched. No marks, no disturbed grass, just empty ground, as if it had never existed. I searched every corner of the garden, the perimeter near the wall, even behind the shed, but there was nothing. Only when I turned back toward the house did I see it again. It was standing by the side door this time, finger raised straight toward me. I backed away, slowly, unable to look away, the detail of its face clearer. Now the erosion of the stone hadn't softened it completely. I could make out faint ridges where eyes should be, hollowed lines for a mouth pulled in what might have been a grimace or a smile. I didn't move it. I couldn't. I went inside and locked the door for my room upstairs. I could see through the window, perfectly framed by the glass, motionless but unshakably deliberate, still pointing at me. That night I dreamed the sound of stone dragging across concrete, a long, slow, scraping echo that crawled through the halls of the house. I woke up to silence, hard pounding, and when I dared to look toward the window, the statue was no longer outside. It was standing directly beneath my window, now staring up the finger, still raised, unwavering, unblinking, pointing only at me. I didn't sleep after that night. Every few minutes I checked the window, expecting to see it move, but the statue never shifted while I was watching. Only when I looked away, even for a moment, did something change the next morning. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt wrong still, but heavy like a held breath. The statue hadn't moved far, maybe only a few feet closer to the wall, but the angle of its arm was different. The finger no longer pointed at the window, but at the ground just below it. When I crouched to see what it was aimed at, I noticed the dirt. There was loose, darker than the rest. I brushed some of it aside, expecting maybe a root or rock, but what I uncovered was something smooth and round. I dug with my hands until I revealed more of it and froze. It was the corner of another statue, or rather the broken top of one, buried just beneath the soil. It was a head. I could only see half the face, but that was enough. It looked exactly like the statue that now stood above it. Same smooth stone, same cracked lines along the cheek, but this one was missing the eyes. The sockets were hollow, deeper than the surface allowed, almost like tunnels that had been carved inward. I covered it back up without thinking, my hands shaking even as I pressed the dirt down hard until the outline disappeared. I didn't know why, but it felt like uncovering. It had woken something up that day. I tried to go to work, but the bus never came. I waited at the stop for nearly an hour before realizing that not a single car had passed the road. The whole time the air felt heavy and strange, like the entire town had paused. I turned back toward the house and noticed from a distance that the curtains of the upper floor, the unused room, were open now, though I had closed them days ago back. Inside, everything was too quiet. I avoided looking out the windows altogether, but the sound followed me everywhere, a faint, dragging, scraping noise like something heavy being pulled over tile. It stopped whenever I turned my head, only to resume softer, slower, always behind me. I checked every room in the house, the basement, the attic, even the old hallway closet. The noise never came from anywhere I could see, but from everywhere else at once. When I finally gave up, I sat in the living room and turned on the old radio to drown it out, but all I got was static. I kept it on anyway. The static was at least human in its chaos. Then I heard the knock. It was soft, deliberate, and wrong somehow. Not against the front door, but lower, as though someone was knocking on the wall itself, just below the floor. I turned down the radio and listened. It came again, 3 slow knocks followed by a pause, then 3 more. My heart was pounding so loud it was hard to tell which sound was which. I knelt to the floor, pressed my ear against the boards. The knocks stopped, replaced by something else, a faint hollow breath that came from directly beneath me. I jumped back and ran to the front door, but when I reached for the knob, I saw it through the window beside the entrance. The statue was back in the garden, not under my window anymore, but at the base of the stairs leading up to the porch. Its arm was raised again, finger pointed straight at the front door. For a long time, I just stood there staring at it. The sun was setting behind it, and the shadows stretched long across the yard. The finger's shadow cut across the steps and stopped exactly at my feet. I told myself I'd move it tonight, get it as far away from the house as possible, but when I went to bed, I couldn't bring myself to go outside. The dragging sound had returned, louder than before, now mixed with the faint scrape of something tapping against the walls. It moved around the house, circling slow, deliberate. Every few minutes a pause, like it was listening before sliding on again. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I woke the next morning, sunlight had filled the room. The house was silent again. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined all of it, until I noticed that the light from The window felt dimmer than it should. The curtains weren't open anymore. The fabric bulged inward slightly, as though pressed from the outside. I walked closer, heart hammering, and pulled them apart. The statue was standing on the porch, just inches from the glass arm, extended finger touching the window pane, directly in front of my face. There was no space for it to have fit through the door, no marks on the steps, no drag lines on the porch. The stone was flawless, but its face was clearer than ever now. The faint hollows where eyes should have been were no longer smooth, they were deep black. And when I leaned closer, it felt like they weren't carved, but empty, leading into some impossible depth. And though it didn't move, the arm stayed perfectly still, I swear. I heard something faint inside the glass, a whisper, so quiet it could have been breath, the sound forming one word pressed through the air between us. Closer. That morning, I couldn't bring myself to touch the curtain again. The window pane still carried the faint outline of where the statue's finger had rested, an oily gray smear in the shape of a print, but stone shouldn't leave residue. I stayed inside the entire day, refusing to look outside when the light shifted. Through the hours, I could tell that something was wrong with its direction. The shadows didn't line up the way they should. The statue blocked sunlight that should have reached the wall, yet the room stayed dim, as if it was feeding off the light itself. By evening, I started noticing small things out of place. The kitchen chair had been turned slightly toward the hallway. The front rug was off-center. My reflection in the hallway mirror lagged for a second before matching my movements. I told myself I was exhausted, but the delay was real. When I raised my hand, my reflection followed a heartbeat later. That mirror was old and narrow, running from the floor almost to the ceiling. I had never liked it, even before all of this, but that night it felt alive. When I walked past, I could see the faintest movement in its surface. Even when I wasn't facing it, the reflection of the living room flickered like the air above a fire. My eyes began to play tricks on me, but then I saw something clear enough that it wasn't illusion. Behind my reflected shoulder, the statue stood in the mirror's version of the hallway, arm raised, finger aimed at my reflection's throat. I turned instantly, but the real hallway was empty. I stared at the empty space for a long time before forcing myself to turn back to the mirror again. In its surface, there was only me, this time pale, shaking, but alone. I tried to steady my breathing and walk away, yet the moment I reached the living room, the smell hit me. Wet stone. It wasn't dust or dampness. It was that mineral stench you get when you touch old statues that have been buried in the earth. The smell came from the walls, the floor, the air itself. I sat on the couch and pressed my hand against my face, trying to think, but all I could hear was faint movement above me, slow, steady shifting, as if someone heavy was crawling across the ceiling. The sound traveled across the room, then stopped right above the hallway. Mirror, a light crack formed in the plaster overhead, thin and spreading. The air grew colder. When I finally gathered the courage to look, the mirror's surface had changed. The reflection was dark. The hallway inside it no longer matched the one behind me. It looked deeper, endless, its floor vanishing into a black that pulsed like breath. The faint shape of the statue was visible far in the distance. Within that darkness, its arm no longer raised, but hanging by its side. I could see the head tilt slightly. Then the reflection blinked. I dropped to the floor, pulling the throw blanket from the couch over the mirror's frame, covering it completely. I didn't want to see it again. I didn't even want to walk past that part of the house that night. I locked myself in the bedroom. But sleep didn't come. Every sound felt amplified. The ticking of the old wall clock, the creak of settling within. Beneath it all, the faint dragging. I thought I'd imagined it before, but this time it was unmistakable. Something was moving again, circling the house, slow, deliberate, the same rhythm, As before, the sound stopped every few minutes at the walls like it was listening, then it would move again, closer, softer. At one point, I felt a vibration run through the floorboards beneath my bed. The nightstand rattled slightly, and the picture frame fell forward. I reached to pick it up and froze. The photo inside had changed. It was the same picture as before, a family photo of my parents and me taken years ago. But now, there was a new shape behind us, a stone figure standing among the trees in the background, its head turned directly toward me. I tore the photo from the frame, my hands trembling as I stared at the tiny detail. The more I looked, the clearer it became. The face wasn't just directed at me, but smiling, slightly not carved in expression, but cracked open at the mouth, as if something inside the stone was pressing outward. I shoved the photo away into a drawer and tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the sense that the walls themselves were tightening around me. The air felt heavy, too dense to breathe. Then from downstairs came the sound of glass shattering. I ran to the door, but didn't open it. I listened instead, frozen. The noise had come from the living room, the direction of the mirror. For several seconds there was nothing but silence, then faint footsteps, slow, measured, soft against the floorboard. Something was inside. The steps paused halfway across the room, then turned toward the hall and began to ascend the stairs. Each creak was clear, deliberate, patient, like whoever or whatever it was already knew I was awake. The sound reached the top step, then stopped right outside my door. I waited for a knock or a turn of the handle, but nothing came, just stillness, so complete it made the blood roar in my ears. I pressed my palm to the floor, feeling for vibration, but there was nothing. Only when I drew my hand back did I notice the faint line of gray dust that had appeared under the door and curled inward across the floor toward the bed. I followed the line with my eyes as it reached the foot of the bed, then vanished as though absorbed by the floorboards. When dawn came, I barely realized that the light in the room dimmed, the air thick. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. Halfway down the corridor, the blanket I'd thrown over the mirror was gone. The frame stood uncovered, its surface perfectly clean, but the reflection wasn't mine. The person in the glass wore my clothes, had my face, but the skin was cracked, the eyes hollow, black stone dust spilling slowly from the mouth. The figure raised its arm and pointed directly at me, and though I turned and ran, I knew before I reached the stairs that the mirror version didn't stay behind. After that morning, the house stopped feeling like my own. The rooms looked the same, but the light that filled them wasn't daylight anymore. It was a flat, pale glow that gave no warmth. I tried to open the windows, but the glass wouldn't move, not even an inch. I checked my phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen stayed black, as though it had no charge. Even though I had plugged in overnight, the air in every room felt heavy with dust. It coated my tongue and burned when I breathed. When I passed the mirror in the hallway again, the reflection no longer moved. It just stood perfectly still, as though it had been painted there. But when I leaned closer, I could see the faintest flicker deep in its eyes, not movement exactly, but depth. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a spacious surface that had learned how to mimic me. I backed away, slowly keeping my eyes on it, until I turned the corner. Then I heard it scrape against the frame. I didn't go near it again. I stayed in the kitchen, sitting on the floor with my back against the fridge. It was cold and steady, and I could almost pretend I was still safe. I must have stayed like that for hours. The smell of wet stone kept coming, stronger every few minutes, until it drowned out everything else. That same smell that had clung to the photo. When I finally dared to move, I found gray streaks running along the floor like trails of ash leading from the hallway toward the front door. My hand trembled when I touched one. It wasn't dust. It was fine powder, like crushed rock, warmth to the touch, though the room was cold. The trail ended at the doormat. I opened the door, expecting the front yard, the street, the air. Instead, there was nothing but a low, pale fog, rolling slow across a flat ground that looked like concrete. I took a step out and realized the noise I thought was wind was actually whispering. The fog moved like breath. I looked to where the statue had stood in the yard, but it was gone when I turned back the house behind me. Didn't look right. The windows were black from the outside. No light from within, no sound at all. The door stood half open, but the entryway beyond it seemed smaller, as if the entire building was folding on itself. I felt something move in the fog behind me, a faint vibration through the air like footsteps, but when I turned there was only the fog shifting again in slow, deliberate waves. I ran back inside and slammed the door, but the moment it closed, I heard the click of another door opening. Somewhere deeper in the house the sound echoed too long the way it does in empty halls. I shouted out in panic, but the air swallowed the sound. There was no echo, no response. I crept toward the living room and froze. The mirror was gone. The wall where it hung was smooth, unbroken, no trace that anything had ever been mounted there. But there was still a faint shape in the dust, a human outline pressed into the wallpaper, as if something had leaned there for too long. Then I saw movement in the kitchen. Doorway across from me, not the reflection this time, but real motion. A hand, gray and cracked, slid slowly along the doorframe. Its fingers left smears of powder on the white paint. The rest of the arm followed. Then a shoulder ahead. It was the statue, or something wearing its shape. Its eyes were hollow pits that seemed to breathe, its chest rising and falling. Though stone doesn't breathe, each movement released faint dust into the air, like ash drifting upward. It took one step forward, and the boards creaked under its weight. But instead of a footfall, there was a low, dry, cracking sound like stone breaking. I ran the front door, opened into the fog again, only thicker now. The fog pressed against me, almost solid, and for a second I could feel shapes moving within it, fingers brushing past my arms. My lungs burned with the dust filling them. I tried to shout, but the sound came out broken. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind me, and collapsed onto the floor. The air was vibrating, every wall alive with a slow, pulsing rhythm. The entire house seemed to be breathing. I pressed my ear to the ground and heard a faint hum deep below, like the sound of grinding rock. I crawled toward the window, hoping for light, but the glass had gone opaque. I couldn't see through it anymore. Just faint outlines moving on the other side, shapes like hands sliding across the surface, leaving streaks that faded slowly. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought maybe I'd fallen asleep at some point, and this was a dream. But the smell kept pulling me back to the truth. That awful scent of wet earth and stone wrought the same as the day the statue appeared that night. I didn't sleep. I sat in the hallway across from the place where the mirror had been, waiting for something to happen. The walls pulsed gently with the same slow rhythm, like a huge lung around me. Then around midnight, I felt air moving past me from behind. I turned, expecting open space, but the wall was gone. It had become another hallway, stretching endlessly, dimly lit by a light that came from no source. I took one step inside, then another. The floor beneath me looked the same, but the sound was wrong. It echoed too deep, as if I were walking on hollow stone far down a corridor. I could see movement, shadows slipping from one side to another, too quick to see clearly. The air grew colder the deeper when I turned once to look back, but the opening I'd come through had vanished. Only the endless hallway, now walls that breathed faintly as though alive. Then a voice whispered right behind my ear, finishing the sentence I hadn't said out loud yet the thought. I was just forming in my head. The voice was dry and heavy, the sound of stone grinding. It spoke the word I had been about to think. Help. The hallway went silent. After that, the air held still, thick with dust. I realized then that whatever this place was, it had been waiting for me, waiting for someone to follow the trail it left behind. I turned to run, but the floor was soft now, sinking slightly beneath my weight. It wasn't wood anymore, it was ash, and in the silence between my steps, I could hear faint laughter echoing from every direction, not loud, not human, just the sound of stone smiling. I don't know when I lost the sense of day or night. The light in the house had stopped changing, and every clock had frozen. The air had thickened into a gray haze that tasted like dust and ash. Every breath scraped my throat raw. I hadn't eaten or slept in what felt like days, but I didn't feel hunger or fatigue, just a constant dry ache that reached deep into my bones. The hallway stretched endlessly now. Each time I turned a corner, it folded back into itself. The walls pulsed faintly with that strange rhythm, the slow rise and fall like lungs drawing breath. Sometimes I thought I could hear faint murmurs behind them, a distant chorus speaking words I couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was my imagination, until one of the voices whispered my name. I started to run, but the floor seemed to resist every step. It was soft beneath me, shifting slightly like soil wet beneath stone. I turned left, then right, searching for a door, any exit. Then up ahead through the dim haze, I saw something moving. At first, I thought it was my own shadow, until it lifted its arm and pointed directly at me, the same gesture I had seen from the statue the first day I found it in the yard. It stood motionless at the end of the corridor, but as I moved backward, it didn't shrink. With distance, the perspective was wrong. I could feel its presence getting closer, though it never moved. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. When I opened them again, the corridor was gone. I was back in my living room. The lights flickered weakly. The mirror had returned, hanging once again where it had been before, but the reflection was wrong. The room behind me looked older, darker, covered in cracks. The version of me standing in that reflection wasn't moving, but it was smiling. I watched in horror as that other me slowly lifted its hand and pointed upward. The ceiling above creaked, and a slow crumble of dust fell around me. The sound grew louder, deeper, until I could feel it in my chest. The mirror shimmered faintly, and I saw movement behind my reflection, something gray, shifting closer, its shape too familiar, the jagged outline of the statue, its head tilted slightly, as though curious. The reflection stepped forward and pressed its hand against the glass. The surface rippled like water. I stumbled backward, but the mirror's surface bulged outward, following me, the shape of the hand pushing through solid glass, leaving a trail of dark dust. It began to breathe. The sound was faint at first, then heavy, rhythmic, matching the pulse of the walls around me. I shouted, but my voice didn't carry. The house had swallowed sound completely. I ran for the door and pulled it open. The world outside was gone, only fog and faint figures standing still within it. Dozens, maybe hundreds, they were all facing me. I recognized one immediately, the old man from across the street who had disappeared years ago. His eyes were hollow, his skin covered in gray dust. He raised his arm and pointed to something behind me. I turned. The mirror was right there, even though I had left it behind. Inside the house, it stood in the fog like a window suspended in air, and within it the other me was still smiling. The statue stood beside him, its hand resting on his shoulder, and in the reflection's hand was the same set of house keys I carried in my pocket. The reflection lifted the keys and pressed them into the statue's hand. Then the glass began to crack slowly. Lines spreading across its surface with a deep sound that vibrated through my teeth. The reflection turned its head toward me, lips still smiling, and mouthed words I couldn't hear, but I understood all the same. You shouldn't have looked. The glass shattered. Outward, a rush of cold air struck me hard enough to knock me to the ground. I couldn't see for a moment, the fog swallowing everything. Then I felt fingers grip my ankle hard and drag me backward into the mist. I kicked and screamed, but my voice was gone. My body was being pulled across the rough ground toward the mirror frame, now lying broken in the fog. Behind it was not reflection, but a hole dark, an endless breathing slowly like the walls of the house. I clawed at the dirt, trying to stop myself from sliding. Closer, my fingernails split. I felt blood run down my wrists, but the pull was stronger. A hand made of stone rose from the fog and closed around mine. The touch was cold and dry, and when it squeezed, I heard my bones creak. The statue leaned close, its face inches from mine. Dust fell from its eyes like tears. It whispered something without sound, and I understood it somehow. It wasn't the first time this had happened. It had been here long before me, long before this house ever existed, and now it was my turn. The darkness pulled me through. When I opened my eyes, I was standing again in the living room. But it wasn't mine anymore. Everything was older, cracked gray light streaming faintly through dirty windows. The mirror hung across from me. The reflection showed the house as it used to be, bright, clean, alive. I reached toward it, and my reflection did not move. I watched as someone else entered the room, the new owner, perhaps holding the same photograph I had once found. He looked at the mirror, then directly at me, though he couldn't see me. His expression changed, confusion, then unease, and as he turned away, I realized the truth. I could not move. I could not breathe. My body was stone, my face cold. The mirror shimmered faintly, and I saw myself through it, standing still, eyes hollow, unmoving, pointing straight at him. Outside the house, a wind blew, scattering gray dust through the air. It settled on the steps, forming a faint trail that led down the path toward the gate, the same path that someone knew would one day follow. Drawn by curiosity or by the faint glint of something half buried in the yard, the head of a statue pointing toward the door.